Ms. Bintou Keita, Special Representative of the Secretary-General and Head of the United Nations Organization Stabilization Mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Mr. Huang Xia, Special Envoy of the Secretary-General for the Great Lakes region. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Bintou Keita.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, Madam Minister of State, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Thérèse Kaikwamba-Wagner, the Permanent Representative of the Republic of Rwanda, Ernest Ramucho, the Permanent Representative of the Republic of Angola, dear colleagues, Huang Xia, Special Envoy of the Secretary-General for the Great Lakes region, and all other ambassadors that are joining us for this session. Thank you for having convened another emergency meeting of the Council relating to the recent developments in the east of the Democratic Republic of the Congo and the need to find a way out of a crisis which represents a clear threat to the peace and stability of the Great Lakes region. This session is taking place in a context marked inter alia by the appointment of a new president of the African Union at the summit on the 15th of February. I would like to congratulate His Excellency, the President of Angola, João Lourenço, mediator of the African Union in the framework of the Luanda process. I hope that his mandate will be marked by the silencing of the guns on the continent once and for all. Despite many international calls for a ceasefire and a cessation of offensives, the M23, supported by the Rwandan army, has continued to make progress in the provinces of North Kivu and South Kivu. This advance has had devastating consequences, leading to the loss of many human lives during the taking of Goma. In 2 weeks, the Congo River Alliance, of which the M23 is one of the main components, has established a parallel administration in Goma with the designation of a governor and a mayor. In South Kivu, the M23 has taken control of Kavumu Airport and Bukavu, the provincial capital, on the 16th of February. The M23 has since then continued its advance and yesterday seized the town of Kamanyola, which is at the intersection of the 3 borders between the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Rwanda, and Burundi. Since the taking of Goma, the M23 has been imposing severe restrictions on MONUSCO's freedom of movement, preventing efforts aimed at evaluating damage done to Goma Airport and efforts to support the safe elimination of unexploded ordnance in the city. The M23 has also prevented MONUSCO from resupplying with water and other vital goods the troops of the Southern African Development Community mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, SAMI DRC. What's more, the M23 is in control of all roads entering and leaving the area under its control. That poses serious challenges to the civilian and uniformed personnel of MONUSCO for rotations which are essential for the implementation of its mandate, the priority of which is the protection of the civilian population. What's more, MONUSCO's essential infrastructure in Goma and in other parts of North Kivu is under extreme pressure. These facilities are sheltering persons that sought refuge there in order to enjoy the mission's protection in accordance with international humanitarian law. However, these facilities were never designed nor equipped to house a large number of people in the long term. The situation is particularly critical because health and hygiene conditions are rapidly deteriorating, presenting a risk both to the protected persons and the personnel of MONUSCO. This is feeding disinformation and is being used to amplify anti-MONUSCO sentiments. Mr. President, The human rights situation in North and South Kivu has considerably worsened. In addition to cases of deaths due to fighting between the M23 and the security forces of the DRC, MONUSCO has also documented cases of forced recruitment. We are still observing ongoing movements of displaced persons around Goma. The majority of the former sites have been dismantled and pillaged by host communities and displaced persons, and those persons are going either to their places of origin or to new collective centres around Goma. Even though there are still uncertainties over the exact circumstances of these secondary displacements, the conditions for a safe, voluntary, informed and dignified return in line with international principles may not be guaranteed. What's more, we have recorded many searches of hospitals and homes by the M23 looking for soldiers and civilians perceived to be opposed to the group. The United Nations Joint Human Rights Office receives on a daily basis requests for individual protection from various social actors, including human rights defenders. The latter are often faced with threats, and there are risks of reprisals by M23 in areas under its control.
President, the M23's offensive in North Kivu and South Kivu has increased the vulnerability of girls and women to conflict-related sexual violence, mass displacement, the influx of combatants and prisoners, and the proliferation of weapons have considerably exacerbated the risk. At the same time, logistical and security constraints continue to hamper the United Nations' ability to verify reported cases. In South Kivu, fighting in the Haut Plateau caused a high number of injured. Medical supplies need to be transported to Ivira to be able to assist the wounded. The situation is calm in Bukavu, where humanitarian actors are resuming their activities. Humanitarian response continues in Ijwi, where over 100,000 displaced people arrived in January, as well as in Minova, where around 200,000 displaced people are staying with host families. Humanitarian actors must continue to have access and be able to do their work unhindered to keep assisting this vulnerable population. Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, I welcome the conclusions of the joint summit of the East African Community and the Southern African Development Community on the situation in the east of the Democratic Republic of the Congo on the 8th of February in Tanzania. This summit reaffirmed the call for a cessation of hostilities and an immediate ceasefire. The summit also insisted on the resumption of direct negotiations and dialogue with all state and non-state parties, including M23, in the context of the Luanda and Nairobi processes. It also reaffirmed the call for the neutralization of the FDLR and the withdrawal of Rwandan troops from Congolese soil. It is essential that the provisions of the communiqué from the EAC-SADC summit relating to the restoration of essential public services, the immediate reopening of Goma airport, and the primary supply routes, including over Lake Kivu, be implemented immediately in order to alleviate the suffering of the population. I encourage the heads of the military staff of EAC and SADC countries to meet on a constant basis to determine modalities for the implementation of the ceasefire, as well as urgent measures provided for in the communiqué. In addition to the reopening of the Goma airport requested by the summit, the reopening of Kavumu airport would also be essential. The United Nations, including MONUSCO, remains determined to support all efforts to bring the parties to the negotiating table in order to find lasting political solutions to this crisis, which risks engulfing the entire region. In this regard, it is important to recall the significant progress made in recent months in the context of the Luanda process. It is crucial, As underscored in the communique from the African Union Peace and Security Council meeting in Addis Ababa on the 14th of February, that what has been achieved not be lost.
It is imperative that this Council takes urgent and decisive steps to avert a wider regional war. I call on this Council to hold the perpetrators of human rights violations and abuses in the Democratic Republic of Congo accountable. In this regard, I welcome the adoption by the Human Rights Council on 7th February of a resolution establishing a fact-finding mission to be followed by an independent commission of inquiry to investigate and document violations of human rights and international humanitarian law in the Eastern DRC. Finally, I call on all parties to uphold their obligations to protect civilians in full compliance with international humanitarian law and international human rights law. This includes the inviolability of United Nations premises and installations in the Democratic Republic of Congo, including the safety and security of individuals under MONUSCO's protection. Thank you for your kind attention.
I thank Ms. Keita for her briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Huangxia. Mr. President, members of the Council, I would like to thank you for this invitation to give a briefing on the developments in the situation of Eastern DRC and also to share with you some information about the regional situation. The dire situation now urgently requires parties to pay close attention together and immediately take concerted action to respond.
At the end of January, we witnessed history repeating itself worryingly when M23, supported by the Rwandan Defense Forces, once again stormed the city of Goma. Today, after only 3 weeks, M23 now controls Bukavu, and if our information is correct, they continue to advance towards other strategic areas in North and South Kivu. At this stage, we are not aware of the intricacies of the M23 agenda and do not really know the intention of their backers. Neither do we know how far they will go or why, but what we do know, in the light of developments in recent weeks and in view of acts on the ground as well as public statements made by stakeholders in the region, is that the risk of a regional conflagration is more real today than ever before. This situation must stop before we see the triggering of a widespread regional war, the consequences of which would be devastating from several points of view. Consequently, we must all step up our efforts to avoid undoing and undermining, indeed, all efforts made over the last decade, aiming to achieve stability, cooperation, and the integration of countries in the Great Lakes region. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council, I hail the countries and organizations in the region who have rallied to quickly respond to the crises. They've done that, namely, by convening various summits. The summits of the EAC summit, the SADC summit, the Heads of States Conference of the Central African Community, and there was also the Heads of State Summit on the Humanitarian Situation held in Malabo, along with the joint EAC SADC Summit. All of these summits unanimously underscored the crucial importance of respecting the territorial integrity of the DRC. They roundly condemned the M23 offensive and also as well as the support afforded to that group. At the same time, the summits emphasized the need to rapidly find a political and diplomatic solution to the crisis. In this connection, the joint EAC-SADC summit marks a key step in terms of the emergence of a regional approach which is finally coordinated, concerted and unified in nature. It is laying down the cornerstones for a consensus-based resolution to the crisis in Eastern DRC. The joint summit emphasized the need for a political solution, calling for the resumption of direct negotiations and dialogue with all stakeholders. The joint summit also called for the merging of the Nairobi and Rwanda processes with a view to bolstering coordination and ensuring complementary work, as well as the creation of a coordination mechanism at a secretariat level. Moreover, the African Union Peace and Security Council met at heads of state level on the 14th of February. It enshrined the decisions reached at the joint EAC-SADC summit. At the same time, it recalled the need to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the DRC and condemned the activities of both the M23 and its backers. The Peace and Security Council also called for coordination to be strengthened, as well as for technical support and for the implementation of financing mechanisms in order to buttress peace efforts. It's now important that we see the expeditious and effective implementation of the outcomes of all of these summits. I am delighted to here note that the preparations for the Chiefs of Staff meeting of EAC and SADC are underway, and that the meeting could be held in the coming days. Elsewhere, the secretariats of these two regional organizations, as well as the AU Commission, have guaranteed that they will follow up on the decision to implement a joint technical coordination mechanism. Consultations are also underway between member states concerned in order to establish the modalities which will see the merging of the Nairobi and Luanda processes. These include namely the possible appointment of additional facilitators to bolster both coordination and coherence. I should take this opportunity to call for women to be duly included in these mediation mechanisms in accordance with common commitments entered into regarding women's participation. Moreover, I here wish to commend the role played by Congolese civil society stakeholders, particularly that played by religious leaders. They have spared no effort in recent weeks to consult all relevant stakeholders with a view to bringing them back to the negotiation table. All of these processes are encouraging. However, they must be supported and followed up by regional action. As far as I'm concerned, I have undertaken consultations with all stakeholders involved in order to encourage coordination and the speedy implementation of provisions agreed upon. These provisions are crucial if we are to ultimately achieve the de-escalation of the situation on the ground. They're also vital in order to support humanitarian aid, the protection of women and girls that have been victims of violence, and in order to guarantee the resumption of a dialogue which involves all relevant actors in accordance with decisions taken by heads of state. In the next few days, I will continue to engage with regional stakeholders to encourage them in their efforts and to reiterate that the United Nations stands ready to extend to them political and technical support. President, distinguished members of the Council, as catastrophic as the situation may appear today, it can, of grow worse. 12 years after the signing of the Framework Agreement and 19 years after the signing of the Pact of the International Conference on the Great Lakes region, history is repeating itself, unfortunately. We must take action now. We must act quickly, collectively, and in a decisive fashion. As we were reminded by our Secretary General, we must quickly guarantee the implementation of these following 3 immediate priorities. 1, de-escalation via an immediate ceasefire and through all parties' compliance with international law and their upholding of commitments entered into as part of regional and international mechanisms, including the Addis Ababa Framework Agreement. The latter, indeed, demands that no one tolerate or supply either assistance or any support whatsoever to armed groups. It also calls upon all parties to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of neighbouring states. The cessation of hostilities is a matter of urgency if we are to address the devastating humanitarian consequences of the conflict, as well as the consequences for human rights. If we are to lay the necessary foundations for a constructive dialogue. The second priority is the resumption of dialogue. We will never hammer this home enough. The solution to be found is a political one and not a military one. Dialogue and compromise are necessary to find a lasting solution. As such, I here urge all parties to return to the table and to draw upon provisions already agreed upon by the parties within the Rwanda and Nairobi processes, or within any other processes which may arise. This in accordance with decisions taken by heads of state in the region. I urge all parties to engage in good faith in these peace efforts and to support them because they are essential in order to resolve the crisis and avoid a regional war. Let us work together to restore the ceasefire, to restore the territorial integrity of the
Parties must respect international humanitarian law and ensure unrestricted humanitarian access. We strongly condemn all forms of human rights violations, abuses, violence against civilians, summary executions and maiming, sex and gender-based violence, recruitment and use of children. Fourth and last, we reiterate our full support to MONUSCO, which is acting within its mandate and doing critical work in the DRC, stress our strong commitment to the safety and security of its peacekeepers, and condemn the attacks committed against personnel. MONUSCO must be granted full access and freedom of movement. Its personnel must be allowed to return to Goma in order to effectively fulfill its mandate, in particular the protection of civilians and address urgent needs. The protection of civilians and of humanitarian and medical personnel must remain an absolute priority. Attacks against peacekeepers may constitute potential war crimes, and those attacks against MONUSCO peacekeepers form also a basis for potential sanctions designation. Mr. President, we stand ready to support any further engagement of this Council as necessary. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for their statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also want to thank the briefers, Bento Keita and Huang Xia, for briefing us. And we want to welcome Foreign Minister of Democratic Republic of the Congo. And we also want to welcome representatives of the region in the chamber. Given the rapidly evolving security situation and escalating humanitarian concerns, we believe this Council meeting is critically needed. In the Eastern DRC, the situation is swiftly and visibly deteriorating into mounting peril. Civilians are caught in the eye of a violent storm. In the words of Special Envoy, there is a risk of regional conflagration, and the risk is real. Regional peace and security is in danger. Following the seizure of Goma, reports showcase a shocking death toll and thousands with life-altering injuries. The violence must stop immediately. There is no justification for for the horrific stories of summary executions, including children, for widespread conflict-related sexual violence, for widespread displacement, for child recruitment, for intimidation against human rights defenders and civil society actors. We categorically condemn any targeting, threats, or attacks on humanitarian workers and denounce these actions in the strongest possible terms. It remains imperative that those responsible are held accountable. Mr. President, the gravity of this crisis extends far beyond the immediate human tragedy. The rapid offensive by M23, supported by Rwandan Defense Forces, now marking its presence in South Kivu, with the seizure of key locations such as Kavumu Airport and the city of Bukavu, poses a significant threat to the broader stability of the Great Lakes region. We demand that M23 withdraw unconditionally from all territories they have occupied. Immediate and unrestricted reopening of the airport in Goma must be ensured so that the delivery of humanitarian assistance, the rotation and resupply of UN peacekeepers and other personnel can proceed safely. Unhindered humanitarian access must be ensured without delay, with secure humanitarian corridors to reach those in need. All parties must adhere to international humanitarian and human rights law. We echo the African Union, SADC and EAC in urgently calling for an immediate halt to all hostilities and a return to diplomatic dialogue. We continue to support strong African engagement and regional diplomatic processes, notably through the merged Rwanda-Nairobi process. We continue to call on DRC and Rwanda to exercise the utmost restraint, de-escalate tensions, re-engage in dialogue, address the root causes, and prioritize peace and stability for the region. We condemn any violation of the DRC's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Unauthorized military presence in DRC is a blatant violation of international law and the UN Charter. We call on Rwanda to fully withdraw its forces immediately and to end any support for M23. We call on DRC to stop cooperating with the FDLR and other armed groups. Finally, we condemn in the strongest terms attacks, hostility, and threats against MONUSCO and its personnel. We further denounce the severe restrictions imposed by M23 on MONUSCO and their freedom of movement, which have not only impeded the implementation of their mandated tasks, but have also contributed to a compromised situation at their bases. This is unacceptable. Mr. President, in conclusion, I reiterate what we stated already during the first emergency meeting. This Council must not remain passive in the face of this crisis. We have clearly heard calls from the field and received abundance of reports. Now we must step up. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, SRSG Bintu Keita and Special Envoy Huang Xie, for your briefings and for your leadership. The United States extends its fullest support to MONUSCO and all UN personnel supporting peaceful and humanitarian responses to the crisis in eastern DRC. Mr. President and Council members, how many times must we meet to discuss these predictable cycles of violence? For months, we have consistently watched M23 and Rwanda ignore ceasefires, seize territory under false pretexts, and deny intention of further expansion, only to start the cycle anew. We have witnessed M23 sow chaos and wage brutal violence against civilians on the streets of Masisi, Goma, and now Bukavu, all under the disingenuous guise of liberation or restoring order. The United States strongly condemns the seizure of Kavumu Airport and the city of Bukavu by M23 and Rwandan forces. We continue to stand in full support of the Congolese people and of their country's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
Once again, we urge M23 to immediately cease its offensive and withdraw from all territories of which it has taken control. We urge Rwanda to cease supporting M23, immediately withdraw its forces from the DRC, and hold accountable those who perpetrate human rights abuses and violations. We now have confirmed reports from the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights of summary executions of children at the hands of M23 in Bukavu, among other serious human rights abuses. We condemn these abuses, for which there cannot be continued impunity. We watched with concern Monday's demonstrations at MONUSCO's bases in Goma, and we remain alarmed by reliable reports that M23, with Rwandan support, are orchestrating these protests, which have killed peacekeepers and civilians in the past. We condemn these and all actions that harm UN peacekeepers and undermine MONUSCO's civilian protection mandate, which is so instrumental at this moment in eastern DRC. M23 must immediately cease its hostile threats against MONUSCO, reopen the Goma airport, and ensure the UN's full freedom of movement, particularly at border crossings. In light of Rwanda's support for M23's hostility against MONUSCO, we reiterate that the UN should immediately engage the Rwandan government at the highest levels to underscore the importance of peacekeeper safety and security. Without a change in Rwanda's behavior, the UN should reevaluate Rwanda's ability to participate constructively in UN peacekeeping. We call for protection and free movement of civilians seeking safety, and for all parties to uphold international humanitarian principles, stop attacks on civilian infrastructure, and guarantee unhindered humanitarian access. M23's and Rwanda's actions have also created space for other armed groups to expand their own violent assaults on Congolese civilians. We condemn the latest horrific attacks carried out by Codeco, and we applaud MONUSCO's quick response to defend the population against further violence. This conflict has also exacerbated exploitation and trafficking in eastern DRC's mineral sector, with widespread evidence that 3T minerals are being smuggled to enter international supply chains, including through neighboring countries. We urge an immediate cessation of sourcing of minerals from areas controlled by M23, particularly those identified as red zones by the DRC government. It is beyond time for this Council, the UN, and the international community to marshal a strong and unambiguous response to M23 and Rwandan actions which undermine prospects for peace and bring the region closer to the brink of an all-out war. We fully support the call by the AU Peace and Security Council for an immediate resumption of negotiations and dialogue with all state and non-state parties, both military and non-military, including the M23, under the frameworks of the Luanda and Nairobi processes. Intense and sustained pressure is needed now to compel Rwanda to return to the negotiations under the Angola-led Luanda process and to work in good faith toward a diplomatic resolution to the conflict in eastern DRC. The United States is prepared to work with Council members on sanctions nominations in the 1533 Committee, and we urge Council members to take urgent action. Furthermore, we remain prepared to leverage all the tools at our disposal in order to hold accountable those responsible for sustaining armed conflict, instability, and insecurity in the DRC. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Mr. President, Guyana welcomes the urgent convening of this meeting, given the recent developments in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, particularly in Bukavu. I thank SRSG Keita and Special Envoy Shea for their briefings. I welcome the participation of Her Excellency Ms. Therese Wagner, State Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs, International Cooperation and Francophonie of the DRC, and also the permanent representatives of several other African countries in this meeting. Mr. President, Guyana aligns with the statement delivered on behalf of A3 and wishes to further elucidate in our national capacity. We are alarmed by the recent developments in eastern DRC, with the M23 expanding its territorial gains by more than 30% since 15 January, and with that, its violent attacks against innocent civilians. The reports emanating from the United Nations about increased human rights violations and abuse are extremely concerning and demand a swift response from the international community, including the Security Council. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has confirmed cases of summary execution of children by the M23 after they entered the city of Bukavu last week. The office has also documented cases of ill treatment, conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence, child and forced recruitment, intimidation, and death threats. Guyana condemns these violations by the M23, reportedly with the support of the Rwandan Defense Force, and calls for an immediate ceasefire and for the group to withdraw to the pre-cantonment areas. We also call on Rwanda to cease its support to the M23 and to withdraw its forces from the territory of the DRC immediately and unconditionally. We stress that it is unacceptable for foreign military forces of any country to enter the territory of another without authorization, and call for full respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the DRC. Moreover, we call on the government of the DRC to sever its ties with the FDLR and to implement its commitment to neutralize this group. Mr. President, as with any conflict situation, it is always the innocent civilians that bear the brunt. In this regard, we urge the protection of civilians and critical infrastructure, allowing for unhindered access to essential services and delivery of humanitarian aid. We call on all parties to uphold and fulfill their obligations under international humanitarian law and human rights law, including by ensuring the protection of civilians and the delivery of humanitarian aid to those in need. We also reject the severe restrictions being imposed upon MONUSCO's freedom of movement, preventing efforts to assess the damage at the Goma airport and to assist with the safe disposal of unexploded ordnance across the city. MONUSCO must be allowed to implement its mandate without restrictions. We further emphasize that attacks against peacekeepers may constitute a war crime and call for all hostilities against peacekeepers to cease. Guyana extends its full support to MONUSCO in the implementation of its mandate and insists on full accountability for any attack against MONUSCO personnel. Mr. President, the ongoing offensive in North Kivu and South Kivu poses a significant threat to peace and security of the Great Lakes region and risks a wider regional conflagration. We must ensure that this does not happen. For this reason, Guyana supports the initiative for this Council to speak with one voice and send a clear message to the parties. As we continue our deliberations on the draft resolution under consideration, we urge fellow Council members to focus on the bigger picture, to support the regional efforts, to not only address the current crisis, but more importantly, its root causes, and to find a lasting solution. We also encourage the international community to work together to de-escalate rather than fuel tensions. There is no military solution, as was said before, to this crisis, and now is certainly not the time for soundbite diplomacy. Any action that pulls states away from dialogue condemns their entire populations into cycles of conflict and violence, and it is always the innocent civilians that suffer. The path to a lasting solution will only be found through dialogue, diplomacy, and the rule of law. In this regard, Guyana fully supports the regional mediation efforts, including the Luanda and Nairobi processes, and welcomes the ongoing efforts of the African Union, the East African Community, and the Southern African Development Community in responding to the crisis. We also welcome the communiqué adopted by the AU Peace and Security Council following their summit meeting of 14 February, which endorsed the decisions of the EAC, SADC, and joint EAC-SADC meetings, and encouraged the international community to support their implementation. More importantly, we urge Rwanda and the DRC to return to dialogue and diplomacy, to fully implement their commitments under the regional processes, and to engage in good faith with each other to reach a peaceful and sustainable solution. In conclusion, Mr. President, Guyana reaffirms its support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the DRC and for all efforts that will bring peace to the region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are grateful for the briefing by the Special Representative of the Secretary General and Head of MONUSCO, Bintou Keita. We're also grateful for that of the Special Envoy of the Secretary General for the Great Lakes region, Mr. Huang Xia. Their leadership is vital at this watershed moment for stability in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and throughout the region. We recognize here the participation of the Distinguished Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, as well as that of the representatives of countries in the region that do us the great honor of attending today. The Republic of Panama expresses its deep concern at the alarming escalation of violence in eastern DRC. In recent weeks, the M23 rebel group has stepped up its military operations, taking control by violence of strategic cities such as Goma, its airport, and more recently Bukavu. These actions have claimed thousands of lives and have forcibly displaced hundreds of thousands of people, further worsening a humanitarian crisis which was in and of itself already catastrophic. Moreover, we are alarmed to note the ratcheting up of tensions between the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Rwanda. Their relationship is now at a critical juncture following the recent exchange of accusations regarding cross-border incursions and support of armed groups. With this in mind, we urge all states in the region to exercise the utmost restraint and to reaffirm their commitment to existing diplomatic mechanisms, specifically to the Luanda process and the Nairobi process. Effective adherence to these mechanisms is vital to ensure that tensions abate and to ensure that we establish a lasting peace. Mr. President, the violence unleashed by armed actors does not only affect the civilian population, it also stands as a grave challenge for MONUSCO, who are facing growing threats and operational restrictions. Moreover, we once again reject any form of violence that undermines the safety and physical integrity of civilians. We also urgently appeal for the strengthening of the protection of our blue helmets. Moreover, we support the appeal issued by UN entities for the implementation of temporary humanitarian pauses in critical areas, as well as their appeal for the establishment of safe and effective humanitarian corridors which should guarantee access to vital assistance. Elsewhere, Panama fervently condemns grave human rights violations, including sexual violence as a weapon of war and the forced recruitment of boys and girls by armed groups. These atrocities cannot go unpunished. We urge the Security Council to strengthen the sanction regimes against those who perpetuate the violence, and we urge the Council to ensure that those responsible are brought to justice in international courts. To conclude, we reaffirm our staunch and unwavering commitment to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We urge specifically M23, to halt their advances and to withdraw completely and immediately, with stringent adherence to the ceasefire and with absolute respect for mediation processes currently underway. At the same time, and for the same reasons, we urge Rwanda to cease its support for M23, to use its good offices in order to de-escalate this conflict, and to withdraw their armed forces from the territory of the Democratic Republic of the Congo as soon as possible. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Panama for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank SRSG Keita for informing us of the current situation on the ground, and Special Envoy Shia for his briefing on regional peace efforts. I welcome the presence of Her Excellency Foreign Minister Wagner at this meeting, as well as all the representatives from the region. Mr. President, Denmark strongly condemns the ongoing offensive by the M23, backed by the RDF, as well as the recent capture of Kavumu airport and the city of Bukavu. The offensive has resulted in immense suffering and risks plunging the region into an even deeper and wider conflict. There can be no military solution, only a political one. What is urgently needed is the resumption of dialogue with all state and non-state actors, including the M23, within the framework of the Rwanda and Nairobi processes, respect for international humanitarian law and human rights law, and the full respect for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the DRC. We call on Rwanda to immediately withdraw its forces from DRC territory and to cease its support to the M23. The M23 must immediately halt and reverse its ongoing offensive and withdraw from the territories it has taken control of. We call on the DRC to cease its support to the FDLR. Mr. President, allow me to make 3 points. First, what we are witnessing in North and South Kivu is nothing short of a man-made humanitarian catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands of civilians are urgently seeking protection from violence, persecution, rape, disease, and death. Humanitarians have been attacked and killed, humanitarian warehouses and facilities have been looted, access and supply routes have been obstructed, and civilian infrastructure has been attacked. This leaves civilians, including women and children, at even greater risk. This is unacceptable. Denmark demands the full, safe, and unhindered access for humanitarian and medical staff, and demands that all parties immediately uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law. Second, we are appalled by the reports of ongoing serious human rights violations and abuses taking place in North and South Kivu, including summary executions and sexual and gender-based violence. We condemn any attacks and threats against journalists, human rights defenders, and members of civil society organizations. Those responsible must be held to account. We welcome the recent decision by the Human Rights Council to support such efforts. Third, we reiterate our unwavering support to MONUSCO as it continues its mandated task in a highly complex environment. The actions of the M23 and RDF are not only putting peacekeepers at risk, but also obstructing the implementation of the mission's mandate. The safety and security of UN humanitarian personnel, including those sheltering in MONUSCO bases, must be ensured. This also goes for freedom of movement of MONUSCO. We reiterate that targeted attacks against MONUSCO peacekeepers constitute a breach of international law, may constitute a war crime, and may serve as a ground for the imposition of UN sanctions. Mr. President, let me conclude by commending the African-led efforts to reach a solution to the crisis in the eastern DRC. Spearheaded by Angolan President Lourenço, we last year saw a glimpse of hope in the Luanda process. That momentum must be maintained. We reaffirm our unwavering support for any future joint peace process owned by and for the region, including by the East African Community, the South African Development Community, and the African Union. As a matter of international peace and security, however, the Security Council has responsibility to take action for the peaceful resolution of the conflict in eastern DRC. It is our duty to urgently consider how to utilize the available means to halt and reverse this escalation, ensure humanitarian access, and safeguard stability in the region. Denmark stands ready to work with all members to this end. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we thank the Special Representative of the Secretary General, Bintou Keita, and the Special Envoy of the Secretary General, Huang Xia, for their briefings. We welcome the participation in the meeting of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Teresa Wagner, as well as the representatives of Rwanda, Angola, Burundi, Kenya, South African Republic, and Zimbabwe. We would like to begin by expressing our condolences to all of the citizens of the DRC that died and continue to die as a result of the escalation by the M23 in the past few months. Russia expresses its solidarity with the government and the people of the DRC in this complex period. We insist on the need for unreserved respect for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence and unity of that country in accordance with the UN Charter. We also again express our condolences to the families of the fallen UN peacekeepers and soldiers of the Southern African Development Community. We stand in solidarity with the governments of the DRC and the states that have lost their service personnel. Attacks on peacekeepers are unacceptable in all circumstances. Russia firmly condemns the M23. We call for an immediate halt to the fighting and the withdrawal of fighters of this illegal armed formation from the settlements it has seized and the DRC's territories it has occupied. We also call upon Rwanda to react to the relevant demands from members of the Security Council and the African Union to lift its defensive measures and to withdraw its military units. Escalation in the east of the DRC must be stopped. However, a military path to resolving the crisis does not exist. It will only be possible through a political agreement of the DRC and Rwanda, which need to return to the negotiating table and confirm their commitment to their mutual obligations in the framework of the Luanda process and agree on how to stabilize the situation. This conflict has a long and very bloody history, and its root causes need to be addressed. A lasting settlement will only be possible after ending state interaction with illegal armed formations. They include the Democratic Forces of the Liberation of Rwanda. In particular, I would like to highlight that without resolving the status of the M23 within the inter-Congolese dialogue, a viable political formula to end the conflict will not be found. The parameters for these processes need to be determined by Kinshasa and Kigali together. Otherwise, everything that is happening now could spill over into an interstate conflict of regional proportions, and we are already seeing more and more preconditions for that. Mr. President, Russia welcomes the efforts of regional states and African leaders to support stabilization in the east of the DRC. We note important decisions following summits of the African Union, SADC, EAC, and ECAS. We hope that the parties will heed the voices of their neighbors on the continent and that the declared measures will be adopted and will bring results. The main thing is that there must be an end to the suffering of the civilian population. We are deeply concerned by the humanitarian consequences of escalation in the east of the DRC. We are following with alarm the reports of more and more cases of extrajudicial exactions, violations of human rights, sexual violence, and the recruitment of children into the ranks of illegal armed formations. All of that must end. Mr. President, specifically, we would like to express our position on the well-known but intentionally neglected subject of the operations in the DRC of private military companies from Europe. We all saw them turn over their weapons to MONUSCO peacekeepers, and clips of the subsequent transporting of European mercenaries to Kigali were seen around the world. We think that these events do not entirely correspond with how Russia sees the mandate of the mission given to it by the Security Council. We are also convinced that the silent reaction of our European and American colleagues to such checkered facts contradicts their declared commitment to condemning African bilateral security cooperation with other states. This is particularly surprising given the years-long disinformation campaign against Russia because of its increased cooperation with African states. This is neo-colonial double standards on full display. And incidentally, this is also one of the reasons why the conflicts in Africa are continuing. In conclusion, we would like to assure you that Russia will continue to facilitate efforts to curb the escalation and to restore the prospects for a diplomatic settlement. The Congolese people need peace, security, and confidence in the future. That is what we will be guided by in our work in the Council. Thank you.
I thank Russian Federation for the statement. I give the floor to United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I thank SRSG Keita and Special Envoy Shia for their briefings today. And I welcome the participation of DRC Foreign Minister Wagner in this meeting, as well as the representatives from other countries of the region. President, I'll make 3 points. First, we express our deep concern at the continued advance into DRC of the M23 and Rwandan Defence Forces. This is an unacceptable violation of DRC's sovereignty and territorial integrity and a breach of the UN Charter. The occupation of Bukavu is a serious escalation which heightens the risk of a wider regional conflict. The United Kingdom is clear that there needs to be an immediate cessation of hostilities and a return to dialogue via African-led peace processes. There can be no military solution. As my Foreign Secretary has said, Rwanda must withdraw its troops. The UK is actively considering next steps alongside international partners, including the possibility of a review of all UK support to Rwanda. Second, urgent action is needed to halt the rapidly deteriorating humanitarian situation. The M23 and Rwandan Defence Forces takeover of Goma has displaced close to 1 million people in North and South Kivu. Hundreds of thousands are now in desperate need of life-saving support. Civilians, particularly women and girls, are at increased risk of violence, including sexual violence. We have seen harrowing reports, including of 165 women raped and many burned alive at Goma Muzenze prison earlier this month. The parties to the conflict must adhere to their obligations under international humanitarian law. And humanitarian access, especially via Goma Airport, should urgently be restored. Third, MONUSCO's freedom of movement is essential to support the protection of civilians and facilitate aid delivery. Restrictions by the M23 and Rwandan Defence Forces are unacceptable. The parties must respect MONUSCO's mandate as authorised by this Council. The UK strongly condemns all attacks on UN peacekeepers and recalls that attacks on MONUSCO could be grounds for UN sanctions. President, to conclude, the UK welcomes regional efforts to secure a lasting solution to this conflict. We welcome the contribution of the recent joint EAC and SADC summit and the AU-PSC summit. We urge DRC and Rwanda to engage in good faith in existing peace processes. We need to see the rapid implementation of the actions agreed at the summits, supported by urgent action by this Council. I thank you.
I thank United Kingdom for this statement. I give the floor to Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President, for convening this important meeting. I thank SRSG Keita and the Special Envoy Shia for their briefings. I also welcome Foreign Minister Kaikwamba Wagner of DRC to this meeting. The situation in Eastern DRC is urgent. There is almost no single day that passes without a further advancement by the M23. When this Council met for 2 emergency meetings 3 weeks ago, Goma fell for the 5th time in history. Over the last weekend, the M23 took control over Bukavu in South Kivu for the first time ever, escalating this conflict to a completely new sphere by controlling all of Lake Kivu's access points and the DRC-Rwanda border crossings, M23's illegitimate parallel administrations, if sustained for longer, may also create consequences too deep-rooted to reverse. Moreover, the impact on civilians is devastating, causing hundreds of thousands to displace and regressing human rights, particularly in extrajudicial killings, conflict-related sexual violence, and the summary execution of children. The entire DRC is now at stake, and the situation is literally at the brink of full-scale regional war. In light of this perilous situation, let me emphasize 3 points. First, the Republic of Korea strongly condemns and demands M23 to immediately cease hostilities and withdraw from all occupying areas in North and South Kivu. We also urge Rwanda to refrain from escalating the conflict through its support and participation. We should all be reminded of the fundamental principle of the UN Charter, respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. Likewise, the DRC should also stop its support to specific armed groups and neutralize the FDLR. Exploiting hate speech and mis- and disinformation campaigns to fuel conflict must also end. All parties to the conflict should also ensure MONUSCO's freedom of movement. Any attempt to hinder the implementation of its mandate, particularly through GPS jamming and spoofing, must stop. Attacks on peacekeepers may constitute war crimes, and their safety and security must be prioritized. We cannot lose any more peacekeepers. Second, we urge the DRC and Rwanda to urgently return to meaningful diplomatic dialogue for an unconditional ceasefire. Korea commends and supports the recent joint efforts of the EAC, SADC, AU, and particularly President Lourenço of Angola to find a political solution to this conflict. Now, more than ever, we need Africa's collective wisdom and concerted action for an African solution. We hope that meaningful progress can be achieved by building on the outcomes of the recent EAC-SADC joint statement and the AU-PSC meeting. These efforts should further advance the gains made through the Luanda and the Nairobi processes, paving the way for lasting peace in Eastern DRC. Third, we strongly emphasize the importance of unhindered humanitarian access and the opening of humanitarian corridors in North and South Kivu. Goma and the Kavumu airports should be able to operate without restrictions to deliver life-saving humanitarian aid. Key border crossings also need to be open to allow voluntary and safe movement of civilians and people in need. Mr. President, the Republic of Korea reaffirms its steadfast support for MONUSCO, the Office of Special Envoy of the Great Lakes region, and the regional and sub-regional organizations for their efforts in addressing this tragic crisis. The Charter of the UN entrusted this Council to take primary responsibility for the maintenance of the international peace and security. It is time we put our best efforts to fulfill this mandate on this complex conflict. We sincerely hope that the Council will soon be able to pronounce itself with a decisive and unequivocal message for lasting peace in Eastern DRC. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for the statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of China. Colleagues, to begin with, I thank Special Representative Keita and Special Envoy Xia Huang for their briefings. I welcome Ms. Kaikwamba, Foreign Minister of the DRC, to today's meeting. Recently, after capturing Goma, M23 launched another offensive and entered Bukavu, the second largest city in eastern DRC. The drastic developments in the situation in eastern DRC have stirred the nerves of the international community. Secretary General Guterres recently warned that the continued offensive by M23 threatens to push the entire region over the precipice. The statements by colleagues just now have all further highlighted the gravity and danger of the situation in eastern DRC. M23's offensive has seriously violated the decision of the joint EAC SADC summit, requesting all parties immediate ceasefire, completely breached its commitment of a unilateral ceasefire, and caused the situation to escalate further. China strongly condemns the military operations by M23 and reiterates that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the DRC should be respected, and that the UN Charter and international law should be observed. I wish to stress the following points. First, the international community should urge M23 to immediately and unconditionally cease its offensive and immediately withdraw from the occupied areas. China reiterates its hope that Rwanda will heed the call of the international community, stop its military support for M23, and immediately withdraw all its military forces from the territory. Second, the international community must spare no effort in preventing the conflict in eastern DRC from spiraling into a larger-scale regional conflict. The Congo War over 20 years ago caused millions of casualties. A similar tragedy must not recur. China calls upon relevant regional countries to stay calm and exercise restraint, and refrain from actions that could escalate tensions and aggravate antagonism among the parties. Third, the international community should urge all parties to abide by international humanitarian law, protect the safety and security of civilians and humanitarians, open up, as a matter of emergency, more humanitarian corridors, reopen the airports in Goma and Bukavu, and fully restore essential services such as water and electricity. MONUSCO carries out its task of protecting civilians in accordance with the Security Council mandate, and all parties must refrain from interference and obstruction. The safety and security of foreign missions, foreign nationals, and enterprises should also be fully guaranteed. Fourth, the international community should continue to support the mediation efforts by the AU and sub-regional organizations. China welcomes the dedication of the AU-PSC summit to promoting the political settlement of the issue of Eastern DRC and expects the outcome of the joint EAC SADC summit to be implemented without delay. All parties should call upon the DRC and Rwanda to promptly return to the track of diplomacy and address each other's security concerns under the framework of the merged Luanda and Nairobi processes, including eliminating the threat of the FDLR. Fifth, the major stakeholders should fully leverage their influence by actively exerting it on the countries concerned to promote de-escalation of the situation. China supports the Security Council in actively fulfilling its responsibilities in maintaining international peace, taking responsible actions, and forming synergies with regional mediation efforts. China will continue to call on all parties to achieve a ceasefire, end the fighting, and resume dialogue, and will work tirelessly for the de-escalation of the situation. Thank you. I now resume my functions as President of the Council. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Therese Kaikwamba-Wagner, Minister of Foreign Affairs, International Cooperation, and Francophonie of the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, Excellencies, Council members, I thank you for convening this third emergency meeting on the situation in Eastern DRC. I wish to thank the Special Representative of the Secretary-General, Ms. Bintou Keita, and the Special Envoy of the Secretary-General for the Great Lakes region, Mr. Huang Jia, for their briefings. I also wish to welcome to this meeting the permanent representatives of the various countries of the Great Lakes region. Rwanda is preparing a massacre in the plain light of day with a brutality which recalls the darkest hours of our history. I issued that warning on the 26th of January. Today, these words have become a reality. In only 48 hours, more than 4,000 people died in Goma. Women and men were slaughtered. Children witnessed summary executions. People were killed indiscriminately and executed with spine-chilling precision. There was, for example, the tribal chief from Kiziba, who was killed with his wife and 3 children on the 11th of February. There was the artist Delka Idenga, who was killed on the 13th of February to ensure he did not speak out. And the information we have is only the tip of the iceberg of the horror underway. But this horror is not limited to executions. In Goma, life has stood still. It's been taken hostage by the war. More than 4,500 wounded people have rushed to hospitals that are overflowing. 500 charred corpses were found in the Muzenze prison after mass executions. Every day, the Red Cross and the Red Crescent gather corpses in the streets, while morgues are bursting at the seams. In makeshift camps, cases of mpox, cholera and measles are on the rise. This threatens the thousands of displaced people with no access to drinking water. Those who survive risk dying a different death, dying from a lack of assistance, healthcare or evacuation. Humanitarian personnel are targeted. Their access to victims is cut off. That's what happens when a terrorist group takes control of a city and imposes its criminal rule. As this council watches on, this council observes, this council condemns, but this council does nothing. And now, Bukavu. The same scenario is playing out: pillaging, hospitals destroyed, roads cut off, a guerre which also kills through hunger and through care denied. But here again, that is not enough for those waging this campaign of terror. Murder follows hardship. Barbarity follows humanitarian collapse. Yesterday, on the 18th of February, the High Commissioner for Human Rights reported that children had allegedly been executed by the RDF M23 coalition. Yes, children's killed like targets at a shooting range. What remains of humanity when even the youngest, the most innocent among us? Mr. President, we have heard this phrase that has now become a lilting refrain: African solutions to African problems. But how can anyone today still have the temerity to use that phrase as a pretext for inaction? The Southern African Development Community and the Economic Community of Central African States, ECAS, have unanimously condemned the Rwandan presence on our territory. Their presence is no longer a matter of debate. 2 subregions, SADC and the EAC, have held joint meetings to adopt urgent measures, including a ceasefire. As far as the African Union goes, its Peace and Security Council convened at a heads of state level on the 14th of February and called for the immediate withdrawal of all uninvited foreign forces from the DRC. In other words, Rwanda. Rwanda and the M23 have responded and continue to respond with violence and with terror. Faced with the rapid deterioration of the situation, myriad actors have reacted by doing what they do best, that is documenting human rights violations, opening criminal proceedings, showing strong resolve, but essentially reacting post facto. We hail the recent decision taken by the UN Human Rights Council to open an inquiry into acts of violence in eastern DRC. We also commend the ICC appeal to gather evidence to bring those responsible to justice. We also support the resolution adopted by the European Parliament calling for the suspension of the commodity agreement reached between the EU and Rwanda. It was signed in February 24, whilst Kigali was arming M23. But this council is still twiddling its thumbs. But it's the only body able to prevent new massacres and the spread of the occupation. It's incumbent upon the Council to adopt robust measures which not only halt the violence perpetrated by the Rwandan troops and their M23 auxiliaries, but also stop the support by a UN member state to a terrorist group seeking to topple a legitimately and democratically elected government. This conflict is not limited to military violence or to the pillaging of our resources or to the fact our people are being driven from their territories. It is a political project spearheaded by Rwanda through M23 and the AFC, a political project aiming to topple our government by force. But the Democratic Republic of the Congo has chosen democracy. A democracy still under construction, of course, but it is ours. We have chosen freedom under a civilian regime and not to be ruled by weapons. No one can take this choice away. Particularly not a regime who for 3 decades now has been hiding behind a man who confuses the state and his personal power. This contrast is striking. On the one hand, we have a people building their future based on the will of that people, and on the other, a regime clinging on through force, intimidation, and repression. Today, this model of governing by fear is attempting to take root in our country. It's not only a war for territory, but a war against our sovereign choice to enjoy a different future. The M23 and its Rwandan backers are seeking to impose by weapons what the ballot box has rejected. But the Congolese people say no. The average age of our people is under 25. Ours is a people marked by war and promises postponed, but a people who refuse to let weapons rule. Our people want to choose their leaders at the polls and not under the threat of gunfire. Our young people refuse to be a generation sacrificed on the altar of externally imposed violence.
The Council must act. It can no longer remain a silent witness to an unfolding tragedy, nor hide behind declarations of intent. The time for theoretical debates is over. It is now time to uphold the very principles that define this institution: peace, security, and respect for international law. International law that is universal and applies to all, even while seeking African solutions. Standing by silently while civilians are killed is not a solution, and certainly not an African one. We reiterate the urgency of these measures and demand immediate action. First, the Security Council must order an end to Rwanda's hostilities and demand the immediate and unconditional withdrawal of its troops from Congolese territory. These forces have trampled on international law, brought death and devastation, and violated our sovereignty. Their withdrawal is not negotiable, it is an imperative. Second, the Security Council must impose targeted sanctions, including asset freezes and travel bans, on the command structure of the Rwandan Defense Forces and the political decision-makers responsible for this aggression, including those who feign ignorance of their own troops' whereabouts. Thousands of Rwandan soldiers are leading M23 operations in our country, while their president, in a calculated display of plausible deniability, says, "I don't know." But you, members of the Council, know. We all know. The survivors who had to bury 4,000 bodies in Goma know. And in Goma, those graves bear witness. Third, the Security Council must impose a total ban on the export of all minerals from Rwanda, particularly coltan and gold, in order to end the looting of our resources. The DRC has taken its own measures by designating several mining sites as red zones, including Rubaya, from where Rwanda fraudulently exports over 150 tons of coltan each month. But national measures alone are not enough. As long as Rwanda is allowed to launder our resources with impunity, this war will continue. Fourth, the Security Council must immediately revoke Rwanda's status as a troop contributing country to United Nations peacekeeping missions. A country that besieges MONUSCO bases, targets its aircrafts, and launches deadly attacks on UN peacekeepers, then goes further, using the repatriation of fallen peacekeepers as a political bargaining chip, has defied the very principles of peacekeeping. This contradiction erodes the credibility of the United Nations. Rwanda's status must be revoked without delay. Fifth, the Security Council must impose a strict notification and monitoring mechanism for any sale or transfer of arms to Rwanda. Every shipment of weapon destined for Kigali must be declared, traced, and closely monitored. It is unacceptable that arms continue to reach groups responsible for massacres and regional destabilization and under United Nations sanctions. Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, 3 meetings in under a month. Today, you have all condemned Rwanda in your statements. I do apologize, says the Speaker. All of you except the A3, namely Algeria, Somalia, and Sierra Leone. But we are still waiting for a resolution. The time for endless compromise has passed. It is time to act. The DRC is hereby calling for a public vote without delay on a resolution which clearly denounces Rwanda's occupation and which demands the withdrawal of its troops. A resolution which defends the United Nations Charter. We've had enough of pretexts. We've had enough of cultural relativism being used to disguise a wait-and-see attitude with tragic consequences. Must take a stand in the plain light of day. Mr. President, Excellencies, Council members, it is time to vote. I thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Kaikwamba Wagner for her statement. To the representative of Rwanda.
Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the floor. Allow me first to congratulate you on your presidency and leadership of this council. I also thank Ambassador Huang Xia and SRC Bintu Keita for their briefings. I also recognize the participation of Honorable Teresa Kaikwamba Wagner, Minister of Foreign Affairs of DRC, and the representatives of Kenya, Angola, Burundi, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. Mr. President, Rwanda commends the regional efforts led by the East African Community and the Southern African Development Corporation, SADC, particularly the joint summit held in Dar es Salaam on 8 February 2025. The joint summit meeting resulted in positive outcomes, including 1, a call for a ceasefire, 2, urgent humanitarian support, and 3, the merger of the Rwanda and Nairobi peace processes to be led by a panel of facilitators from different regions under President Lorenzo. The joint EAC SADC summit also directed resumption of direct negotiations and dialogue with all state and non-state parties, military and non-military, including the M23. These outcomes were endorsed by an extraordinary AU Peace and Security Council meeting at the head of state level, held on 14 February 2025, as well as the AU Assembly of Heads of State, held on 15th to 16th February 2025. Mr. President, Rwanda appreciates the support of those in this council who value Africa-led solutions. We remain fully engaged in these efforts and continue to support them with good faith and full commitment. However, we must condemn the actions of those, including a DRC, who undermine these efforts by lobbying Western capitals instead of engaging with African leadership and regional mechanisms. Despite the critical nature of the recent regional discussions, the DRC has consistently opted for virtual presence or outright disengagement in these key meetings. While regional leaders gathered at the AU summit to address the Eastern DRC security situation, the president of DRC, President Tshisekedi, was instead seen at the Munich Security Conference, continuing to call for sanctions and lobbying for sanctions against Rwanda rather than engaging in direct dialogues. Other heads of state were sitting in Addis trying to find solutions to these problems. So the biggest beneficiary of these discussions could have been benefited by being in that room. I cannot emphasize this enough. African leadership must drive the resolution of this conflict. Failure to support regional solutions has exacerbated instability in the past. This is why Rwanda calls for the full endorsement of the AU-backed EAC SADC Joint Summit outcomes. Furthermore, at the heart of this crisis is a dangerous alliance between the DRC government and external actors, mainly the FDL genocidal militia, who have fueled ethnic rhetoric and enabled extremism to thrive for decades, but also the Burundian forces, the Sami DRC, as well as European mercenaries. Council members, instead of committing to inclusive dialogue, the DRC has consistently undermined regional mechanisms, pitted regional blocs against each other, disregarded ceasefires, refused dialogue with its own people, and escalated ethnic-based violence. Mr. President, Council members, since the fall of Goma, regional leaders have worked tirelessly to broker peace. Yet, the DRC government has responded by reinforcing its front lines with more troops and Burundian forces. This reckless militarization, coupled with state-sponsored incitement to violence, has created a lawless environment. The uncontrolled distribution of weapons has even led former DRC government-aligned militia to turn against Kinshasa. This we have always said, when a state actor proliferates and distributes weapons to negative armed groups, like the different Wazalendo groups, what you reap is chaos. And what we've seen in terms of the magnitude of loss of life caused by Wazalendo and all these young people who have been given thousands of weapons and mobilized and turned against each other, that's what we reap. Inflammatory statements from DRC officials, such as those made by the Honorable Minister in the previous Council meeting on the 29th January 2025, calling for, and I quote, the streets to take over, have worsened the situation. Indeed, soon after the Honorable Minister's foretelling in this Council, we observed cases of youth mobilization in 2 armed militia in South Kivu, led by known FARDC officers. Arming young civilians in an already unstable context is not only reckless, but an outright incitement to hatred and violence. And there is a lot of misinformation here. When FARDC forces were proliferating arms and including arming children, nobody talked about this. Nobody spoke. And now you see misinformation about execution of children. I repeat, the proliferation of arms by a state actor to negative armed groups, and there are over 250 armed groups documented in DRC. That is a recipe for disaster. And that's the disaster that we continue to see. Arms should be proliferated to designated trained officers and military officers. The situation has deteriorated to the point where we see a lot of humanitarian challenges. Rwanda cannot take the blame for the problems that DRC has faced endemically. As President Kagame stated in Addis Ababa, and I quote, "We have our own problems to deal with. Congo is too big for Rwanda to carry on its back," end of quote. Rwanda has no interest in DRC's internal struggles. Allegations of land grabbing in courts or corrupt or occupation ignore fundamental power imbalances at play in the DRC. Our sole priority has always been and will always remain the security of our borders and the stability of our nation. We have stated over and over again the existential security threat that Rwanda faces from DRC. And this we take very seriously. Council members, Rwanda continues to welcome refugees fleeing the violence in the DRC, despite persistent calls from the DRC and its allies to impose sanctions on Rwanda. Ironically, among those crossing into Rwanda are the same security threats we have repeatedly warned this esteemed council about. On 29th January, over 280 foreign mercenaries, along with over 100 Congolese soldiers, crossed into Rwanda territory, exposing the FARDC's long-standing use of foreign fighters with no reaction whatsoever from the international community. Yet, as we have repeatedly said, the use of mercenaries by state actors contravenes the 1989 United Nations Convention and the 1977 OAU Convention, which prohibits and illegalizes the use of mercenaries by states. More concerning is the international community's reluctance to address the existential threat Rwanda faces, the ethnic cleansing of Congolese Tutsi, and the misinterpretation of the conflict. Instead of acknowledging the DRC's responsibility, blame has been conveniently shifted, first to Rwanda, and now even to former President Joseph Kabila. When will this blame game end? I think someone here has to take responsibility. Reality has always been clear. The M23's resurgence is rooted in decades-long persecution of Congolese communities based on ethnicity, predating Rwanda's current government. Rwanda has consistently warned that the FDR is central to this crisis. Since 2018, over 20 incursions have been launched into Rwanda, particularly in the southern province and in the northwestern region. Despite claim that the FDR is a weakened force, its active collaboration with and financing by FARDC proves otherwise. The DRC government must recognize that its coalition with the FDR destabilizes Rwanda and perpetuates suffering among Congolese civilians. Ignoring the FDR's role is a failure to hold accountable those responsible for exporting extremist ideology beyond Rwanda's borders. But beyond the FDR council members, Rwanda is also concerned by a myriad of foreign forces deployed along its borders, namely the Burundian forces that share the same ethnic ideology as the FDR, SAMI DRC, and the remaining mercenaries. We are also concerned by the president of DRC's push for more foreign troops he is currently requesting from other African countries. All those foreign forces need to withdraw from Eastern DRC as they constitute a direct threat to Rwanda's security. In fact, when Goma fell, FARDC, Burundian forces, and FDLR forces turned their weapons on Rwanda, killing 16 innocent civilians and wounding 177 civilians, and destroying their properties and livelihoods. Yet no country condemned this blatant violation of Rwanda's sovereignty. Rwanda has no choice but to strengthen its defense and will continue to do so. Mr. President, on the question of MONUSCO, we have been very, very clear, and Rwanda's position remains peacekeepers have to be safe, peacekeepers have to be protected, and that is a canon that we respect, and we have said it over and over again. However, transparency is also very important. Information to the Council that is accurate is critical. There is critical information that we believe SRSG Bintu Keita should have shared with the Council on MONUSCO's collaboration with M23, and specifically the outcome of a meeting that was held yesterday between DSRSG, Vivian Van der Per, and the leader of AFC/M23, Colonel Nanga. We believe that that information would have been critical to share so that at least the Council knows. Mr. President, regarding mineral exploitation, the responsible parties are well known who exploit DRC. Rwanda holds no mining concession in the DRC, yet we continue to be falsely accused. The claim that mineral resources fuel this conflict is false and inciting. The M23 issue is about people fighting for their rights and survival, fighting for their inherent citizenship rights and access to their own ancestral property. Rwanda cannot be scapegoated for the DRC's economic dysfunction. It is Congolese officials who benefit most from instability and the corrupt mining sector, whereas Rwanda has always promoted responsible sourcing and formalized trade to curb smuggling and illicit activities in mining. Mr. President, Council members, Rwanda remains committed to regional mechanisms to neutralize the FDLR and ensure the withdrawal of all foreign forces that threaten our security. These steps are essential for Rwanda's stability and lasting regional peace. Once these conditions are met, Rwanda will adjust its defensive measures accordingly. We urge the DRC to engage genuinely in the EAC SADC peace process and call on the international community to support these Africa-led initiatives rather than imposing counterproductive measures. If sanctions or punitive measures were the solution to this region's problems, Rwanda would be the first to support them. However, history has shown otherwise. These only deepen division and undermine regional peace efforts. To conclude, Mr. President, Council members, Rwanda remains guided by the firm belief that our region's future depends on unity, shared prosperity, and inclusive peace. The historical and cultural ties between our communities hold untapped potential, and we hope that through dialogue and cooperation, we can bring lasting peace and development this region desperately needs. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Rwanda for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Angola.
Mr. President, thank you for giving us the floor. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, we acknowledge the presence of Her Excellency Therese Kayekwamba Wagner, State Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs, International Cooperation and Francophonie from the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, and His Excellency Ambassador Ernest Raimusillo, Permanent Representative of the Republic of Rwanda to the United Nations. We thank Mrs. Bintou Keita, Special Representative of the Secretary General in the DRC and Head of United Nations Organization Stabilization Mission in DRC, and Mr. Wang Shi, Special Envoy of the Secretary General for the Great Lake region, for their comprehensive briefings. Mr. President, we are holding the third Security Council emergency meeting in less than a month to address the situation in Eastern DRC as the M23 continues widening its offensive and making significant military advances in North Kivu and South Kivu provinces, despite calls by this Council, the Peace and Security Council of the African Union, and other actors in the international community to halt its operations. Angola firmly and unequivocally condemns and repudiates these actions, which can have unforeseen consequences for regional peace and security if not stopped now. We are very concerned with these latest developments and reiterate our call for the immediate and unconditional cessation of hostilities, the withdrawal of M23 from occupied areas, as well as the end to the establishment of parallel administration in the DRC territory. In line with the UN Charter, the international law, and the principle of sovereign equality of all member states, the sovereignty, independence, and unity and territorial integrity of DRC must be respected and upheld. Angola calls on the parties to the conflict to respect international humanitarian law and international human rights, protect civilians, internal displaced people's camps and medical camps, and safeguard the integrity and safety of peacekeepers and humanitarian personnel. Attacks against civilians and peacekeepers constitute war crimes, and the perpetrators must be held accountable. As any other country, DRC has the right to live in peace and security to achieve sustainable development. This Council has the responsibility to assist the people and the government of DRC to achieve these aspirations by acting swiftly and decisively to prevent further escalation of this conflict and promote its peaceful resolution through the Luanda and Nairobi processes. We call on the members of the Security Council to work expeditiously to adopt a resolution, namely urging the immediate and unconditional ceasefire and cessation of hostilities, and the peaceful resolution of the conflict through the Rwanda and Nairobi processes, in line with the communiques of the Joint East African Community and SADC Summit of Heads of State and Government, convened on 8 February 2025, and the Peace and Security Council of the African Union meeting at the Heads of State and Government level, held on 14 February 2025. Mr. President, on 14 February, His Excellency João Manuel Gonçalves Lourenço, President of the Republic of Angola, who was mandated by the African Union as chair of International Conference on Great Lake Region to ensure mediation of the crisis between DRC and Rwanda, presented a report to the Peace and Security Council of the African Union outlining his efforts to achieve peace to this protracted conflict. He stressed that the progress made under the Rwanda process must be preserved and upheld, which include the declaration of ceasefire of 4th August 2024, the adoption of the harmonized plan for the neutralization of the FDLR and the disengagement force lifting of defense security measure by Rwanda, the adoption of the concept of operations, CONOPS, and the operationalization of the reinforced ad hoc verification mechanism. Please note that the only pending matter to finalize and consolidate the draft peace agreement proposed by the mediator is a divergency regarding the resolution of the M23 issue, which falls within the scope of the Nairobi process. It is important to emphasize that the M23 issue is not objectively and directly part of the Rwanda process mandate, since it has always been understood that the matters relating to the different armed groups operating within DRC should be dealt with within the framework of the Nairobi process. His Excellency João Manuel Gonçalves Lourenço has reiterated time and time again that the conflict and security challenge in the eastern DRC have no military solution, and urged the parties to return to the negotiating table immediately. He continues making diplomatic efforts in favor of peace and stability in the DRC, now in a new and additional role as the chair of the African Union since 15 February 2025. At the sidelines of the Peace and Security Council meeting in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, on 14 February, he met His Excellency Paul Kagame, President of the Republic of Rwanda, and yesterday in Luanda, Angola, he hosted His Excellency Felix Tshisekedi, President of the Democratic Republic of Congo, to discuss the way forward. We call on the international community and the Security Council to continue supporting the ongoing regional initiatives to enhance coordination, harmonization, and complementarity between Rwanda and Nairobi process to promote African solutions to African problems. Mr. President, a speed and unconditional de-escalation of the conflict and the genuine and renewed engagement of the parties to explore ways of overcoming the pending issue are paramount to create a political environment conducive to a peaceful solution under the Rwanda and Nairobi processes. We encourage all the parties to avoid any actions or rhetoric that can further escalate tensions, including provocative language or inflammatory public statements, since they are counterproductive to the diplomatic efforts to achieve lasting solution to this conflict that has prevailed for so long. As His Excellency President João Manuel Gonçalves Lourenço stated during the Peace and Security Council of the African Union meeting, and I quote, "It is only makes sense to continue the peace effort in the eastern of DRC if there is serious engagement from the parties and coherence regarding the commitments made, so that the time and energy are not wasted on actions that have been undertaken to restore peace to this attacked sister country. End of quote. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of Angola for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Kenya congratulates the People's Republic of China on assuming the presidency of the Security Council for the month of February and commends Algeria for its stewardship in January. We also thank the briefers, as well as Minister Wagner of the Democratic Republic of Congo and my colleague peers from the region. Mr. President, Kenya is concerned. Kenya is deeply concerned over the escalating unrest in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, which imperils the stability of our entire Great Lakes region. The loss of lives of civilians and peacekeepers and the displacement of persons that characterize the conflict compound the already dire humanitarian situation in Eastern DRC. We reiterate the call of the joint EAC SADC summit for an immediate and unconditional cessation of hostilities by all the conflicting parties and the withdrawal of foreign actors from the DRC. The attendant effects of the unrest remain dire for the entire Great Lakes region. Widespread displacement of persons, an influx of refugees, the spread of infectious diseases, and increased arms proliferation. In addition, the threat of terrorism posed by ISIS DRC risks burgeoning as the group leverages the unrest to advance its nefarious activities. Mr. President, Kenya is the current chair of the East African Community, and it reiterates the joint EAC SADC summit's position to advance a political rather than a military solution in addressing this conflict. In this regard, we reaffirm our commitment to the Nairobi-Luanda process as the most viable framework for dialogue and reconciliation. We also urge the parties, all parties, to exercise political goodwill and genuinely engage in mediation. We call upon our dear neighbors, DRC, Rwanda, and all others to please tone down the finger pointing and give dialogue a chance. It is in our collective interest as a region. Please let's tone down the finger pointing and give dialogue a chance. It is in our collective interest as a region. Whereas Kenya remains committed to supporting diplomatic efforts to restore stability in Eastern DRC, the international community must do more. We therefore call upon this Council to act decisively to contain the prevailing unrest. We must put an end to the death and humanitarian suffering of local populations. UN agencies and other humanitarian organizations must be given unhindered access. On our part, Kenya remains committed to all efforts that will bring peace and stability, not just to Eastern DRC, but to the entire Great Lakes region. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Kenya for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Burundi.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, allow me first of all to express our gratitude to the People's Republic of China, which is holding the presidency of the Council for this month of February. Thank you for convening this third meeting in a month on the situation in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. This initiative demonstrates the commitment of the People's Republic of China to peace and security in the Great Lakes region and within the Security Council. We would like to thank Ms. Bintou Keita, the Special Representative of the Secretary General of the United Nations and head of MONUSCO, and Mr. Huang Xia, the Special Envoy of the United Nations Secretary General for the Great Lakes region, for their highly informative briefings on the situation in the DRC. In particular, I would like to thank and hail the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the DRC and greet the colleagues who are here present. First of all, Burundi would like to recall that it is in the DRC, strictly in accordance with a bilateral agreement in line with the FDN press statement of the 20th of May 2023. Mr. President, Burundi, faithful to its principles of peace and solidarity, remains deeply concerned by the deterioration of the situation in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The persistence of conflicts, particularly in the east of the DRC, the seizure of Goma by the M23 supported by Rwanda, and the extensive occupation of vast areas by foreign forces constitute all a grave threat to regional stability. This situation is exposing the limits and weaknesses of our current peace mechanisms. It is essential that the international community take immediate measures to prevent a regional war. In this regard, Burundi proposes a 5-point peace plan, which is based on the principles of dialogue, regional cooperation, and respect for national sovereignty. We firmly believe that a lasting solution to the conflict in the DRC requires collective, urgent, coordinated action. These, then, are the key elements of our peace plan. 1. International mobilization to avoid an escalation of the conflict. It is essential that the international community, including the United Nations and regional actors, engage urgently to prevent an escalation of the conflict in the DRC, and that they exert the necessary pressure on those involved in aggression against the DRC in violation of the cardinal principles of the United Nations Charter, including sovereignty and the territorial integrity of the DRC, as well as its political independence, with a view to achieving concrete actions. And if no immediate action is taken, the crisis could transform into a broader regional conflict, threatening not only the DRC, but also the entire Great Lakes region. We call for a rapid, coherent, determined response to avoid a regional conflagration. No one would be able to accurately predict the security and humanitarian consequences of that in the region. There could even be ramifications for other regions of the continent. 2. The withdrawal of uninvited foreign forces and the dismantling of armed groups. To achieve a lasting peace, it is necessary for uninvited foreign forces, including those from Rwanda, to withdraw immediately from the DRC and to respect its territorial integrity. In parallel, the international community must actively support the dismantling of all armed groups, both local and foreign, including the FDLR, which continues to feed instability in the region. It is crucial for these actions to be carried out in a way that protects Congolese civilians. They are the primary victims of this violence. Inertia and a wait-and-see attitude on the part of the international community is helping perpetuate the fighting and feeding the appetite of the aggressor to continue occupying Congolese territory. This could set a negative precedent that would encourage other states to use force to nibble away at the territory of other independent states without fearing action on the part of the international community. Another day without concrete action to end the war in the east of the DRC would equal hundreds of deaths of innocent civilians, including women and children. No. Let us act quickly to be on the right side of history. If we do nothing, history will record that when the time came, the international community left the situation in the east of the DRC to deteriorate, with grave security and humanitarian consequences. The credibility of this prestigious council, an organ responsible for international peace and security, depends on it.